Have one announcement. The next colloquium, next Wednesday, will be delivered by David Lammy. He's the MP at the UK Parliament, and he will be speaking on the persistence of race and class in the political discourse of Britain. But now, please welcome to the podium Jamaica Kincaid, distinguished author and professor of African and African American Studies in research here at Harvard.
We don't mess around. I saw people say, God damn. Sorry, a little footnote.
I thought there would be an elaborate beginning, so I was comfortably sitting there waiting for my turn to come. It came much too quickly. Anyway, good afternoon. My name is Jamaica Kincaid. It's an honor, really, to speak of ZZ Parker. If you were in the West Indies, you'd be ZZ.
Hi.
ZZ.
Can you hear it in the back?
Oh, you I don't know what to do about it. That's better.
Project.
Now you've made me all nervous. ZZ Parker. May I close this? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Born in Chicago in 1973, lived in Atlanta and Louisville, Kentucky as a child, went to Yale and graduated in 1994. Zowina Parker is her name. Yes? Yes. Finding, she says, that other people found Zowina difficult to pronounce, she reformulated her name into the last letter of the alphabet and then doubled it, ZZ. To go from Zowina to ZZ shows early on her gift for translation, her gift for making simplification more complex. For who would not rather just learn to say Zowina and leave it at that than to say ZZ? For ZZ keeps you wondering, what does it mean? XX or YY makes an easy association, but ZZ, what is it? There's an obvious association, a metaphorical one, a bond to the simplification, the deflection that she gives away with that gesture, ZZ. Her most important work so far is a gathering of short pieces, stories is what they're called.
Can we turn that off, please?
You should be. It's very disturbing. Her most important work so far is a gathering of short pieces. Stories is what they're called. Drinking coffee elsewhere. In a very good writer, titles are profoundly important. Drinking coffee elsewhere. Drinking is clear and straightforward enough. We all know how to drink. But no coffee. Coffee is one of those staples of the world's economy that transformed for the most part, human consciousness. Coffee is native to a small area of the world, southern Africa, Ethiopia, to be more or less exact. Warriors used to chew on the beans before they went into battle. But now the coffee, with all its stimulating effects, its consciousness-altering properties, are the daily ritual of some people elsewhere. We are all now drinking coffee somewhere else other than where it comes from. To me, this is the genius of the book. It is comprised of 8 stories, and they're called short stories. A lesser writer would have made each story into 8 novels, but each of these stories contain the depth and breadth of larger works: love, humor, tears, loss, betrayal. It's all there, nothing out of place, nothing superfluous. In Parker's work, there is no wasteful gasp of surprise or twinning of hair around your fingers, a sign of confusion, or some other demonstration of ennui that is so trivial you wish these characters were, if not dead, certainly never to have existed at all. In her work, her characters wear the way the world has shaped, modified, limited their moments of joy and happiness as if it were a second skin. Despair is not in their emotional vocabulary. They shrug off misery, and yet they do not deny its existence. And here's an example of this. This is from Our Lady of Peace. Outside the Travel Plaza, Baltimore stretched black and row house brown. Traffic signals changed. Dusk arrived in inky blue smudges, and slow-moving junkies stuttered their way across the sidewalk as though rethinking decisions they had already made. This, she thought, had been what was waiting for her in Baltimore. That's a wonderful sentence. But here's an even more wonderful one. I found a number that I thought, oh, why didn't I write that? A lesser writer would not say this, and I quote, "The sunset has ignited the bellies of clouds. The mirrored windows of downtown building distort the flame-colored city into a funhouse." And that is from a story called The Ant of the Self. Or this is another one. When you lived in the south suburbs of Atlanta, it is easy to forget whites. It is easy to forget about whites. Whites were like those baby pigeons, real and existing, but really seen or thought about. For the most part, the writer who comes with African American heritage is expected of us constantly to revisit not only the time of our arrival in these Americas, and to make new to the world the degradation they have visited on us, to revive our humiliation and glow in songs written by people who had forgiven themselves for trading our bodies. Amazing Grace. But many of us are beyond that. We too can sing Amazing Grace and truly understand its declaration and admission of transgression and partake in its beauty of the shattered made whole. In Parker's work, she takes for granted that we know of the transgressions and how by now these transgressions have tried to make a species of us, her characters, but then she makes a bond with the whole world when she writes something as easy as it is hard, something like this. "You are my father, the veteran. When you cry in the dark, it rains and rains and rains in my heart." In a rereading of this exquisite book, I was reminded of the stories of Edna O'Brien and Maeve Binchy, two writers from Ireland. The worlds and people they sometimes write about is not so unlike the world of Zizi Parker. The disappointments, the failures, the fleeting happiness is all there. I'm thinking in particular of a novel by Binchy called Echoes, really very good. The characters are what we call white, though due to the legacy of Ireland being the first colony in the English-speaking world, they were regarded and treated the way Africans would come to be regarded and treated in the New World. The hopelessness that would have engulfed an observer on seeing the Irish in America and their contempt for Parker's people might make us think that that thing called empathy is a myth. In the garden, there are plants that are slow to increase, and there are plants that multiply with such vigor that they become a pest. Empathy is the way of the slow grower. It increases, hardly. Sometimes it even disappears altogether, and then it shows up again. Empathy. We talk of a writer's style, we analyze and criticize and even make suggestions. It wasn't until I read this book again that I came to see that empathy is her style, her way of making up her world. Empathy. I say this out of love and admiration for Zizi Parker's work. She's presenting us with a new way of looking at the world in which we human beings, in spite of our travails, retain our human dignity. And so with admiration, I give you Zizi Packer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamaica. Fabulous job.
Thank you so much. That was the wonderful Jamaica Kincaid, and you don't know what it means to me to be here as a Hutchins Fellow for 2018 and 2019, and to have the amazing Jamaica Kincaid actually introduce me. I've been reading her work for a long time. I don't want to say how long, but for an incredibly long time. And she's just simply one of the masters of American fiction. And I can't tell you how honored I am to be here with Professor Gates here, and with my new fellows here. We had a kind of a sort of jam session yesterday after our lunch. But I'll get started with the introduction of my project. I'll do a little introduction I've already, Jamaica's introduced me amazingly much better than I could have actually myself. But I will say, I didn't select my name. I have been called Zizi from my uncles for a long time, but there's like misinformation abounds. But I will say that one of the reasons that I want to start by introducing the novel, but then say that this is a departure for me because I generally write short stories. But I've been working on this novel called The Thousands for, I don't want to say 10 years almost, but it has been about 10 years. And it's in various iterations and various drafts, and I've done various revisions. So I'll just give you a brief overview, but I'll kind of do that with pictures, and I'll tell you also sort of why I decided to write the book along with, as I just showed these various pictures. So The Thousands is this historical novel about the 9th Cavalry, and a little bit about the 10th Cavalry as well. And there were these African-American soldiers shortly after the Civil War who were the first to be in the regular army. So in 1866, they were mustered in, and Congress passed an act allowing for blacks to actually be in the regular army and not simply as volunteers as they were in the Civil War, or part of regiments. So they were in the regular standing army. One of the things that ended up happening with these men, and I'll get to later on at least one woman, is that they were thought to be better equipped to actually handle the Southwest climate. And it was kind of a strange kind of thing to put them in charge of these southern places where Reconstruction was just going on and happening, where you had these whites who were trying to redeem the South. So they were put in this nefarious position, or this sort of very tight position, of being the protectors of the white settlers, even as these white settlers, I use that with air quotes, were trying to get rid of the black soldiers as well as the black townspeople. So the 9th Cavalry, they were mainly in the Southwest, and you had the 10th Cavalry who were in the plains. Now, why was I interested in this? I had been talking with my grandmother about just, her life as she'd been born as daughter of a sharecropper, and she'd gone from Mississippi to Kentucky. And I wondered, and this is similar stories on my father's side of the family, and I wondered, well, what happened to the people who went west? And so now there's a sort of a lot of information about them, about African Americans who went west, and Toni Morrison's written about this, and William Katz, and lots of people, Quintard Taylor. But at the time, I knew nothing about it. And so some of the first people I encountered were the Buffalo Soldiers. So they settled they ended up being mustered in Louisiana and New Orleans, and then later in Missouri, and some of these places. These are two Buffalo Soldiers, as you see. But I wondered what happened with them, and what would happen if here they are trying to fight against these Native Americans, who are also just trying to, as the African Americans are newly freed. And so what were the conflicts? So there were Native Americans, or whites, and African Americans who were on the sort of southwest border all sort of competing for a way in which they became American. The thing that I found fascinating about the Buffalo Soldiers in particular was that they had just not been, at the time I sort of began writing about it, they had not been sort of treated in literature in any kind of way that I had seen the way Civil War veterans had or Civil War soldiers had. So I just was fascinated by these men, and of course you do any digging, and I ended up discovering that there was a female Buffalo Soldier by the name of Cathay Williams. Yeah. She disguised herself as a man, and because of the pervasive racism of the day, I mean, the way that they were checked was the way they would check an animal, you know. So she was completely allowed to join because they did not actually look and to perform a check besides opening her mouth or, you know, to find that her teeth were sound and that kind of thing. So these, so this was shortly after, as I said, the Civil War. These are just various pictures of the Civil War and the devastation later. And they served not only in, I believe that these actually might be some from the 10th. So the name for Buffalo Soldiers, they ended up being called, there were three different sort of reasons why or thoughts about how they got this name. One was the buffalo robes that the ones on the plains would wear. The other was that their hair was curly, and that this reminded the Native Americans on the plains of buffalo scalps. And the other one was the fighting spirit of the buffalo. So they used this as a term for them that was not pejorative, although sometimes white officers would actually use this term as pejorative. So you can actually sort of see on the one on the bottom, there's a soldier who actually has a sort of a buffalo skin kind of coat on. Unfortunately, this one went several times. So I'm just showing you different pictures of different soldiers. So my particular novel starts out, so I'll give you a little background about the Buffalo Soldiers. My particular novel actually starts out in Mississippi, and there is this is just after emancipation, and Lazarus, who is one of the characters, runs away, and he ends up going to New Orleans, where his family is. And so it starts off, and he has this whole, there's a whole beginning in which he's working in the cane fields. And so this is how this starts off. Then at a certain point, so this is, you know, the cane of the era. At a certain point, he ends up, I'll go back to this later. At a certain point, he ends up involved, and I won't say how, in this sort of riots that end up in 1866. So the New Orleans riots were such that you had these, the Constitutional Convention was coming to town. The radical Republicans were then trying to make a way for there to be black suffrage. And this ended up being called a riot, but it actually ended up being the massacre of many African Americans. So he ends up then joining against his will at one point, but then later, he deliberately tries to do this, joining the Buffalo Soldiers, and that was his means of escaping, and then he ends up in Texas. So I'll read little bits of this, and I'll go back to giving you some of the scenes of some of the sense of what these various pictures mean. Here's one aspect of the riot, and then this is kind of my prototype for the character of Lazarus, but I'm gonna just maybe start reading a little bit, and then explaining some more later as I go back. So I'll go back to here. All right. So this is going to be in just sort of bits. I'm not going to read whole chapters or anything, but just excerpts as I can read them, and then give you some more information about them later. All right, the thousands. Early yet, the morning clouds, the color of silver fox, and Lazarus was running. His sister, Mary Celeste, hadn't heard the dogs chasing after them, nor could hear them, being deaf. Despite his gesture signing to her what was the plan and for her to keep up as best she could, she'd nevertheless been treed, and so soon would he, if he were lucky and could make it to a likely pine in time. Earlier, he'd thrown rocks, possibly wounding 2 of the dogs, whom he'd heard nothing from for a while, but the third was in full barking pursuit. "Stay," he tried yelling at her, though of course yelling without gesture did no good, and all he could hope was that she'd made the rustle he'd seen 10 or so pines away. Such an animal ranting he'd never heard before and hoped never to hear again. He couldn't help cursing his luck for letting himself get split from Mary Celeste, then cursed her for being so stubborn and so full of vinegar and so deaf. From the sound of it, the dog who was tailing him was neither gaining nor retreating, just the incessant yelping that was part snarls of threat and part screams of being threatened. Perhaps it had already found its quarry up its tree, and if so, that left Lazarus with nothing to do but stop and push away the pounding blood in his head and struggle to divine where the arcing sounds could be coming from. Perhaps, though, that tree and that quarry the dog had found was Mary Celeste. He cocked his ear, subtracting all the echoes bouncing off the pines until one spot seemed like it might be sure, and the dog leaping out at him from nowhere proved him right. It was one thing to be chased by hounds as a runaway slave, another thing entirely to be a runaway once free, with a deaf sister who'd spent the first part of their escape traipsing off in the woods as if she'd had time to examine every leaf that caught her fancy. And so, 2 years free, Lazarus still found himself hoisting himself up a pine like a runaway, digging his nails into soft bark, aiming towards the clouds above and praying the next branch up wasn't nearly as far away as it looked, nor the hound below as close as it sounded. Where its other 2 companions had gone, who knew? But this one gnashed its teeth and ripped and ranted and barked so mightily Lazarus swore he felt the tree shake. "Get," he yelled, catching his breath on the second or third branch, hanging like a possum. But all the dog did was yell and curse back in its own language. It was now but a small picture below, but that frightened him all the more. He couldn't leave his sister, his charge forever, up in a tree, liable to fall at any moment. And though he knew it was useless, and calling after her deafness was useless, he yelled her name nonetheless, and did it again, but of course got back nothing. So that's one excerpt. Let me see if I can get to another one here. So shortly after he comes back, actually I'm going to read an excerpt from Cathay, who is the woman who disguises herself as a man, but this is actually before she actually ends up being mustered into the service. So, when Cathay felt as if she were waiting in a warm pudding after having delivered the babe, she let her head flop onto the pillow, laced with drool and weepings, angling her head towards the window. There, the sky blurted out snow as if trying to send a message. Yet those same sized flakes had been pouring steadily and unseasonably all over Missouri for a week, and though they no longer carried the force of their mother's storm, they phalanxed on, army-like. Snow in October was supposed to mean good hunting, but of course she would miss out. The last thing Cathay remembered was Miss Danforth saying, "I won't call on the midwife. Darkies are blessed with easy births." And so there was only Cathay's mother to help her deliver the baby when the pain would not ebb, leaving her with nothing to do but watch the window, already frosted, now barely recording the drifts that now flew past as if spirits had robed themselves in snow. She almost welcomed her father coming, even though she knew she'd have to cant his sight from the tents of blankets that ensconced her legs, gaping open so that her child wouldn't taste more air than wool. Her father had been a freeman, not a freedman, so she and her mother were in Jefferson City, Missouri, working under the Johnsons, the whole while he was hired out back in Independence. Whenever he was able to come to Jeff City, the first few days were always him and Osceola getting reacquainted. Her father, a small man, her mother a near giant, but they had had her, so height hadn't halted them any. During their reacquaintance times, Cathay did her sleeping in the kitchen, banishing herself so as to pretend she couldn't hear their business. But when the union came through, they'd been so excited that all their yearning had been put on hold. A body almost couldn't get the two of them to sleep. It all depends on how the Yankee Army treats us, her father would say, pacing. That's how we'll know how things are going to be here from here on out. Either way, we'll build a house. How are you going to build a house, Chief? Her mother had asked, when you ain't even settled on a state. She'd remembered the wild look in his eye, his whole being a little tornado of possibility. That's just it. We can build wherever we want, whenever, wherever. Whenever, wherever, her father's refrain. All these years he'd saved up to buy their freedom, and now they hadn't have to spend a cent. That's God working, her mother would proclaim while slopping the pigs, or while washing the blood from Miss Johnson's rags. The filthier the task, the more times and the more powerfully she'd announce it. That's God working, she'd carol, a sportive sigh bringing up the rear, as if the pronouncement were cake soap with which to scrub away the years owned by a Johnson or a Danforth. No one lost the third time around. She was certain of it. But something else in the room fought against the feeling, and she'd shiver to think a ghost had settled on her for company and sharpened her eyes to pin it down and drive it off. The white folks above ground could not be trifled with. The white dead could do nothing. Thus, most of her 11 years olds was spent slapping them around, asking how it felt, them now wearing the same nothingness she wore every day. Color ghosts needed no apology. For certain, some might be upset, fuming still about the lives stolen from them whilst they yet breathed alongside the living, or searching for some son or daughter sold off long ago, or their home road from which they themselves had been sold off of. But Cathay found that if you put a pan of water out, they mostly kept away. Big water, big ship, the only un-African words Osceola's Mima had ever spoke. Yet she'd always spoke them quaking, her hard distrust of water. White folks had used it bad, not to purify but to scald, not to baptize but to drown. If they got a hold of enough of it together, white folks would find a way to sail them off from those who had birthed them. Enough water, enough white folks, and they'd set to sail black folks from the ones who birthed them too. No color ghosts, this country born at least, abided water, big or small. Most color ghosts helped, knowing the way was hard for them yet living, and helped by visiting eggs and catters upon the whites or reversing fortunes. They spoke to death and begged it off on your behalf. Yet she could find no spirits, white or color, to ask about this child, whom she'd wanted living more than life. For his own sake, yes, but for her own sake and the sakes of the previous two who'd failed living as well. When her first leapt from life, Osceola told her she wasn't ready for a child. She was too young for it. And if she had known the boys who had done it and had killed him, he surely would have hung. When she'd lost her second, her mother told her she wasn't built for it, tall and erect like a tree, branchy, Osceola had deemed her, despite Cathy reminding her mother that she would never grow any shorter. But she knew it also meant she'd heed none coming from near arm's length away and would windmill anyone who tried. That accounted for all her trouble with heathenish boys, with their ropes that did not coil right, with their mules who thought they knew better than she. All horses loved her, but even their horses hated getting shod and gave her grief. Still yet, the horses, the mules, the fickle tomato patches she was called to tend to in this part of Missouri, all she could gentle, but the white boys, no. The white boys of Missouri were their own nation, so numerous they required not one army but two, bushwhackers fronted by Quantrill and his pukes, and jayhawkers, now somewhere on the other side of the territory, almost to Kansas, which her father declared was freer than free, and rolled out land growing sunflowers as big as Osceola's head. The Yankee and the Secesh, as many armies as there were boys to fight. And there were thousands of them, their songs irregular, deaf to rhythm, but not to rhyme, their games brutish and full of wild yelps. Even before 11, she'd fought them as if she wasn't colored, and as if she'd never been cut or lassoed before for their fun. Thank you. I'm gonna. I'll read more as I have time as I go through pictures, and I don't want to keep you here for too long, but I'll just explain a little bit of it.
No, we have to 1:30, so.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought it was until 1. So,
No, but then usually the person speaks for about an hour, and then we take questions.
oh, okay. So I'll stop so you can do. I'll do questions. So this last part that I read from Cathay, you know, I very much wanted her to be this character who, you know, there's not much known about her. She is a real character. She's based on a real character. And I wanted to make it such that I was excavating, you know, a little bit of her history, at least how I saw it. So this began this sort of process by which just, it seems like for years, you know, I had to just sort of figure out who she was and how, not how exactly I wanted her to be, but how I kind of felt that she might be from what I knew of her. So this was kind of a process by which I don't know how to say it without sounding a little woo-woo about it, but I kept having to sort of feel her and go through these iterations of trying to, almost as though I was sort of asking questions of her. The same would happen with Lazarus, who I read the first part from. And so he is going along, and he's, at this point, it may seem as though, you know, you're in the army, you're thinking like 18 or so, but at this time, you know, this was like 15, you know, you're 15 or 16. And so here's this, basically this boy, but he's expected to be this man. And his sister is deaf. And this actually came from my own family story, where I had a great aunt who, you know, grew up in the South, where there was, you know, no access to, so any kind of real, anything like sign language or schools or anything like that. So she had to find these ways of, she lip read and talked to everyone, but she was very determined to eventually find a school to be able to, I see you, Dr. Cornell in the house, thank you so much. So she eventually found a school, and sign language was at this time, there were schools for the deaf and the blind, and there were actually schools for the black, deaf, and blind. But you know, if you think about there being schools for the blind, you'd wonder why. Well, if there are white students who are blind, what does it matter if you have actually black students also there? So there were so these schools that I did discover were in Baton Rouge and in Texas. And I did a lot of extensive research on that. And there were schools that were opened here, actually, well, in New York State for the colored, deaf, and blind is what they were called. Mm-hmm. So all of this became kind of part of the novel. And as I thought, you know, this would take a couple of years, but then it kept taking more and more time because I was going into African American disability studies, and then I was going into finding out about labor and sugarcane during the 1860s, and then before that, and how African Americans banded together and actually brought it upon these organizations, and so that they could actually fight for their rights, and they had early forms of unions. And so when the riot broke out in 1866, which is where the novel really sort of starts and takes off, this was in large part not just because of the Constitutional Convention, because of suffrage, but because you had African Americans in the parishes banding together with actually some of the African Americans who were in the city themselves. So this kind of just took on a life of its own. At first it was, you know, it is New Orleans, and then I was going to Texas, but then I ended up getting into, this is a Buffalo Soldier with a Native American wife, actually herself is probably mixed, Native American and African American. So then it ended up being not going to just Texas, but then in Texas, the Seminole Negro Scouts. Let me see if I have that here. I'm going to just skip over some ones here. So the Seminole Negro Scouts were the ones who started off in Florida. They had actually ended up helping a lot of the Seminoles in the Florida swamps fight off whites who were encroaching upon their land. And then when the Seminoles eventually began to move and clear out and go to Texas, then you had the Creeks who wanted them to enslave the African Americans who were mixed with Seminole, who were some, actually mixed with Seminole, and some just a part of the Seminole tribes. And the Seminoles wouldn't let them. So after some of them peeled away, the Mexican government actually provided some land grants to some of the Seminole Negro Scouts, which I'm trying to see if I find my picture of. I'll go back. I have my pictures of the Seminole Negro Scouts. I promise to go back. I'll set it on here. Oh, this might be one, but it's not very good. So, and I'll get to him later, Nat Love, later. So the Seminole Negro Scouts then ended up being the ones who helped the Buffalo Soldiers. So they became actually part of the Buffalo Soldiers when a lot of the white regiments could not even yet have Native American scouts along with them fighting asymmetric warfare. So this actually aided the Buffalo Soldiers immensely, and this is provided this way in which all of them ended up being able to sort of share this information about who they were, tracking information about what it took in terms of like being some of the first civil rights people, some of the ones who first began fighting for civil rights for African Americans in these towns. So here, one of the ones who in the book, the people they cross paths with is Nat Love, who's one of the first cowboys. Part of this novel has been also combating some of these myths where there weren't any African American cowboys, and of course Mario Van Peebles and some others, and Quintard Taylor have done some of this, in which you have fully a third of the cowboys of the era were African American. So they also provided this, protection to those in towns who normally would have been at the mercy of whites being killing them under Reconstruction. So the Buffalo Soldiers ended up not only being a force to fight fight Native Americans. In the end, they ended up helping the Native Americans, in particular the Apache, and then they ended up actually helping those blacks in towns. So the other thing I'm going to bring up is that when they ended up going to Arizona, despite us knowing the name Geronimo, a lot of us know who Geronimo is. There were a lot of Apaches that sort of have fallen back in history that people don't know of. So Cochise, Mangus Colorados, these are people who tried to actually make concessions to whites, but in the end ended up finding that in every town they went to, in every place they went to, the Apaches were being killed. So this particular picture is of Victorio, who at the time was more well known than Geronimo. And one of the things that Victorio ended up doing was he ended up finding this way in which he would strategically employ, these sort of traditional Apache tactics, so that even though there were 10 or so Apache, then they could fight off multiple army. One of the things that ended up happening with some of the soldiers, though, is because they knew a lot of these skills from the Seminole Negro Scouts, more than the white regiments of the day, they were actually able to be successful against some of these onslaughts. In the end, they ended up helping the Apache, but when the whites would come to Oklahoma, then their lands were taken once again. So I'm going to go back just a little bit. This is what people thought Cathay would have looked like, the person that I just read from. And I'm going to read maybe just a little bit more. This was a picture of them, actually this is like, I believe, the 10th Cavalry. But as you can see, there's a sort of mix of men. I mean, there's this way in which blacks couldn't be officers at the time. Eventually, you had Henry Flipper was able to be one of the first blacks who graduated from West Point. He was not the first to enter West Point, but because of extensive hazing, he was the one who ended up graduating. So he became the first officer, the first lieutenant of the 10th Cavalry. He was brought up on embezzlement charges, sort of trumped up embezzlement charges, and then ended up being ousted. But he's right up until until like 1940s or something, the flipper ditch, which he had created, was still in service. So he was this engineer. He had learned Spanish and had become fluent in it. But he gave a carriage ride to this white woman, and so all the rest of the men in the army, and his particular of the 10th Cavalry, then tried to got him dismissed. So the third person I'm going to read from is from the point of view of someone based on Edward Hatch. And so Edward Hatch took over, or became colonel of the 9th Cavalry, even though Custer was asked to be the colonel of the 9th, but Custer being racist and wanting, even though he was going to be given almost what his brevet title was, he refused to do this. So Hatch in the end ended up being the one who became a colonel of the 9th Cavalry. So I'm going to read just a little bit from him. Find it. Mindful of time.
You're doing fine.
Okay, sorry, I just have this. Hatch. Actually, I think I'm going to. Actually, I don't think I'm going to read from Hatch because I'm still working on a lot of stuff with Hatch. But I'm going to read one more Cathay piece, and then I'll just open it up to questions after that. When the Union arrived at their doorstep, everything was painted the blinding white of high noon sunshine, its heat cooking every living thing. A body could hear and smell them before you could see them, ambling along in raggedy 2x2 formation. They trumped through the overgrown yellow weeds that hadn't been sided away from the footpath and kicked up loose scarves of russet-colored dust. The 4 chickens had gone to greet them, trotted to keep up, squawking and losing feathers. Her mother watched, readjusting the basin on her hip. Without taking her eyes off the soldiers, she started up her orders to Cathay. Go tell them troops they can eat with us tonight, but our missus will chase them out by morning. Cathay feared next to nothing, but her father had been working on their freedom for too long for some soldiers to failurize it. She'd heard the Union had freed, but she'd also heard the Union could leave you stranded in the middle of nowhere, and slave catchers could come. And if you weren't in your own country, no one would know who you were or what you were about, or care that you were 3 months away from having your freedom bought. Miss Johnson said that if they ever came here, they'd try to overrun the place and make us slaves for their own selves. And who do you believe? Osceola said, putting the pepper to her stare. A crazy old woman who can't change her own rags, or your ma? Ma'am, I wasn't saying I didn't believe you, Cathay said. I was just saying what missus say, and telling you she was sober-minded when I said hush. Her mother fixed her with a silence and glare, then set the basin down, squinting into the sun as she tried to reckon how many soldiers and how much time she had before they landed in the yard. When she finished all her figuring, she put forth her final order. You come back as soon as you tell him. You know you are a magnet for bad luck, and the longer you be talking, the more trouble will be on you. Cathay drew up to her full height. I ain't troubled or disturbed or cursed no more than the next gal, she had said, but her mother didn't deem the contrariness worth dignifying. Soon Cathay joined her mother in silence, the men louder as they neared Johnson property. She tried to make out what they were saying, but everything was a jumble of words and sounds and splashes of laughter. When she could finally make out the men's faces, ruddy and bronze from sun, she hadn't thought that these would be soldiers at all. Instead of uniforms, these men wore shirts that were no more butternut or blackberry than blue. Their trousers could have been the trousers of unearthed dead men, as for all their condition and coloration. Then, strangely, the closer they approached the place, the quieter they became, as if all their concentration had been brought to bear on presenting themselves. A distinct odor wafted from them, en masse, and Cathay tried not to cover her nostrils, lest one of the men slap her for high-mindedness. The man who looked a sergeant or a captain stopped a yard short of her. his blue eyes shifting from one poor sight to the next, the farm chickens murderously screeching amidst their shower of their own white and brown feathers, the pale Johnson house listing as if drunken, the shack in which Cathay and her parents lived, more a lean-to than anything else. The sides had been filled with pitch, which oozed a little more each summer, and when a hot breeze came through, it blew bits of chicken feed and hay into the tarred wounds, so that the whole thing looked no better than muddy pottery of dauber wasp. Now she felt as though the officer soldier had seen every year of her life. Through the dusty windows, neither she nor her mother could ever keep fully clean. Before she said so much as good day or a word of greeting, he chucked his chin toward Cathay's shack and said with his Irish accent, "Is that where you live, love?" Love. No person, colored or white, family or Missourian, had ever used the word around her, much less at her, not as a term of endearment, accidental or otherwise. It was not soft, but clear and bell-like in its ring, without a taint of orneriness, so that she was certain he was not advertising his freshness the way most white men in these parts were wont to do. Yet it wasn't a pet name, the kind her father Achieve used for her mother. Sometimes, when her father didn't see Cathay watching, or simply forgot Cathay had been watching, he'd give a little pat on her mother's jiggling rear end and call her Petunia. Petunia, as if he'd never heard of a log-built woman named Osceola who'd once twisted apart a snake and boiled it in a pot during their first escape. Petunia, he'd call out as sweetly as if pouring milk for mewling kittens, and this would send Cathay's mother's eyelashes fluttering up and down like the new rockabye dolls. "Yes, sir," Cathay answered the officer. "Home sweet," she said. She looked at him to see what he would do with this information, but all he did was nod at his head. Love, she thought. That must be some Irish talk. Thank you.
Oh, good.
I'll just use this time to answer any questions you might have and go through this if you need to.
Great, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you
that
so
was
much.
lovely. And it's a subject, the relationship between African Americans and Native Americans is a subject we've discussed, for decades, literally, in this room, because, as you very well know, there's a great deal of romanticization that's going on in the African American community about the relationship with Native Americans. My joke is, all our ancestors ran over the hill, and there was Native Americans waiting, and they, sat around and smoked a peace pipe, and the chief said, "I like you so much, why don't you marry my daughter and come into the tribe?" The average African American slave never saw a Native American. That's just a fact. Second fact is the 5 so-called civilized tribes, one reason they were called civilized is that they owned slaves, just as you said.
Exactly.
The Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Seminole.
Yeah.
But the Seminole had more intermarriages than any of the other tribes, and more of a relationship of equality. The third fact, which came up when we had a job talk in this room last year,
Ty Miles?
was,
Ty Miles? I didn't know if it was Ty Miles. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have
Oh,
interrupted.
no, not hers, for another position. But the bottom line is, the Buffalo Soldiers worked for the United States government
exactly.
to oppress Native Americans.
Yeah.
That's what their job was. So when we have all this romanticization about the Buffalo Soldier, they were like kicking the Indians' ass.
Yeah.
But there were exceptions. We know that some African Americans do have Native American ancestors, but not the 110% who
definitely
think
not.
that they do.
No,
right?
no, exactly. Yeah.
And so I'm interested in and some people, obviously, when people are Proximus, they fall in love and get married. And
Yeah.
But I'm interested in your take on, first of all, I didn't know about the Apache exception, so I'd like you to tell us about that, that the Buffalo Soldiers were helping them.
Yeah.
How could they do that and not get court-martialed, right? Because they're supposed to be
Exactly.
killing them. And secondly, how come black Americans are so obsessed with being Native American? And I ask every black guest on Finding Your Roots this question when they find out, to the great disappointment, that they have less than 1% of Native American ancestors.
So-
There have been exceptions. Oprah, Chris Tucker, and Valerie Jarrett all had significant Native American ancestors. But none of the rest of these Negroes had any Native American
Yeah.
ancestors.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, with the Seminoles, even with the Seminole, they're called Seminole Negroes or Seminole colored Scouts, is what they were called. Even with the Seminoles, even though African Americans have been with the Seminoles for at least 2 generations, almost 3 generations before they ended up going to places like Texas and on the border. One of the things that happened is that even with them, there was very little actual sort of mixing, you know. But what did happen was that you did have a lot of those who had carried along with them a lot of the Seminole culture, you know, that went to Texas. Those ended up going to Texas, and then because Texas was Texas, they ended up going to Mexico, and the ones that went to Mexico ended up actually mixing and somewhat intermarrying with Mexicans.
Right, because if I could give you just a parenthesis, Mexico abolished slavery in 1821.
Yes.
And the second president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, it was a mulatto.
Yeah.
So Barack was not the first black president in the New World. Guerrero was.
And so I have
Which
it in my
is why the Alamo and all that stuff is really about slavery.
Yes.
It was about taking Texas back from the Mexicans because they had all that cotton growing economic potential there, as well as other economic. End of parenthesis. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Go ahead.
And so one of the parts of the book, so in addition to starting off with the cane fields, going into Black disability studies with this deaf character, going into Texas and Reconstruction, and later on Arizona and New Mexico and Reconstruction, part of what this deals with is Lazarus, my character, goes to Mexico. And so most people don't know that there were these, I mean, some people know, but there were these, you know, after the Civil War, you know, when the South basically surrendered, you have Confederates who refused to surrender, and they thought Jefferson Davis was going to come down with them. And so one of the things they did, and Lazarus, my character, gets involved with this, is they would have these Confederate colonies. Later on, some more were in not Mexico, some more in Brazil. They tried to have some, you know, at various places like Guatemala. But in Mexico, what they tried to do is have these Confederate colonies, and they had about 5 or 6 of them. Some say 8. But they would try as much as they could to reinstate slavery. The Mexicans refused to do this, you know, and so the Mexicans would say, even though we're going to give you these land grants, and this part of this happened because you had the French going into Mexico, you had Maximilian go in there, and he was kind of under he was Belgian, and he was used by the Napoleon III to try to actually take over Mexico. So Maximilian would allow the Confederates to come there. The Confederates wanted to have this apprenticeship program. They would bring, quote unquote, you know, blacks, but basically re-enslave them. They found that they couldn't do that. The Mexicans were very vociferous, even despite their own racism in other ways, against ever having any blacks be sold, re-enslaved. And even before this, they would refuse to render over slaves who had gone, they escaped to Mexico. So everyone knows about people, everyone knows about people escaping north. But if you were in Louisiana or if you were in Texas, it was much easier for you to go south to Mexico. And the Mexicans would not render you over. However, the Mexicans had no such sort of policy about the Apache. And when the Apache and Comanche would come down into Mexico, they put bounties on their heads. This led to this sort of this wide range sort of scalping that would occur. A lot of this happened just, you know, this was like during the Mexican-American War. It continued throughout the Civil War and afterwards, which is why the Apache in my novel, you know, they first hate the Mexicans with this just complete vitriol because they were hunted down by them. And then they grew to hate the whites as much as they, you know, did the Mexicans. But in terms of answering the question, is in terms of why are blacks so enamored of having, you know, Native American blood. I mean, I think that it's pretty obvious that you know, to say what actually did happen, which was that you're raped, or someone had like been raped, or your parents or grandparents have been by whites. It's, you know, a lot of a harsher truth to come to grips with. And because you did have African Americans living in close proximity, when you went to these towns in the West, I mean, you pretty much were going to be with nearby someone who was, like, if you were in Texas, an El Paseño, or who was from El Paso, but Mexican American, or someone who was Native American. So this was part of your surroundings, you know. So this is it's easy to sort of think like, oh, okay, well, I must be part this. I look closer in color to these people, or I would like to attribute this hair texture or whatever to this, as opposed to, you know, what went on for generations, which was rape.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. So all those high cheekbones and straight black hair come from being basically descended from victims of rape.
But then you also had someone like, so I had, well, not Love, but someone like Jim Beckworth,
Right.
who gradually, he was like a mountain man, sort of mountain man, and sort of all around cowboy mountain man, whatever. But then he was someone who actually went to, I'm going to not remember precisely which Fayetry clan tribe he went to, but he kind of, because a lot of the Southwestern groups, I don't call them tribes, groups, don't have a necessarily hereditary title. You can, if you have certain valor, certain ways of being, you know, earn a kind of title in which you are a leader, you know?
Sure.
And so he gradually became one of the leaders of this tribe. And so, but what happened is Hollywood got a hold of the story, and Jim Beckworth got progressively whiter and whiter and whiter until when he was in Hollywood, you know, he became, you know, Jim Beckworth, white mountain man versus this African-American man who probably might have had some Native American ancestry, but was with and lived amongst Native Americans. But you would have this in these towns all over. I mean, someone like Cathay, you know, she eventually, you know, she lived in Denver, Colorado, but if you were, or actually when she died, but if you lived in Colorado, if you lived in Wyoming and you were black, you know, a lot of the Buffalo Soldiers who once the majority of the America's sort of onslaught against them was over. They settled in those places,
Yes.
and so they, you know, were around those people.
Let's open up. But just remember, through the 1900 federal census, 90% of the African American people lived in the Confederacy, in the former Confederacy. So you're talking about there was a tremendous concentration of black people in the South. There were very few black people in the North compared to the South, and almost zero out west, comparatively speaking. Professor West, would you like to make a comment or ask a question, sir? Questions, comments, Professor Bobo. Questions, comments, please. Yes. Matt's got the mic. He's in control.
Thank you, Zizi. That was an extraordinary presentation. I guess I have a question about literary studies as it relates to study of slavery or African American history. Obviously, I think many of us have noticed that a lot of the emphasis in black studies these days is in sort of literary approaches. Even, say, like slavery and capitalism, writers are very invested in kind of poetic, literary sort of styling. But then it does seem to me also, though, that there's kind of a divide, and I wonder what you make of this. Like, so on the one hand, like Toni Morrison, like Nas, I would say your work, on the one hand, like literary approaches that are empirically sound or that scholars see as illuminating the historical predicament. And then on the other side, like say maybe the work of Fred Moten, where it's as if he eschews.
Wait, who is?
Fred Moten, maybe.
Okay.
Like he's not really interested in the task of representation or developing an approach to literature or to the black experience that's empirically sound. If anything, he sees that as maybe a trap or a delusion. I'm not quite sure, but I wonder if you see this tension, right, in African American studies, that the idea that on the one hand, literary approaches can be illuminating of a kind of historical predicament, because you've dealt with conscription, escape, renting out of slaves, all these things that you're theorizing in ways that are sort of, I think, very much in conversation with or even advancing historical analysis. And I wonder if you, like what accounts for your stakes in this project, right? Like where do you come down on this question, and do you see the tension that I'm sort of suggesting might exist?
I do see exactly what you're saying, this sort of this tension between, you know, here is this sort of somewhat didactic way in which, you know, the literature can, you know, sort of show this experience that hasn't, you know, been shown as much, you know, I'm not going to say as much, but it's almost as though, you know, we're trying to constantly sort of excavate more and more of what the African American experience is. Is that what you're saying on the one hand? On the other hand, a kind of more aesthetic approach, which is sort of like you said, just in terms of sound. Am I getting that right?
Well, actually, what I like about your approach, like why I like it is to say Nas or Toni Morrison, because I think you blend a really innovative, sophisticated aesthetic with something that's actually illuminating, but I find that, and I think that's a tradition many of us sort of draw upon, but I do find there are other literary approaches that don't actually seem concerned with grappling with the history as such, right?
Gotcha.
Where they sort of see like that the social sciences are suspicious or something like that, and that
Yeah.
like, and that the task of the poet is to somehow like eschew any
Yeah.
concern with empirical data or claims or arguments or
Yeah.
or
I see
sort
what
of
you're saying.
ignoring, you could argue ignoring the literature maybe, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't want to like create a kind of a false dichotomy, but I do want to say there's something very interesting about an approach that's like aesthetically pleasing and really innovative, but that's also trying to kind of illuminate something, as opposed to an approach that's sort of not particularly concerned with the literature at all.
Yeah, yeah. I think that I can only maybe answer as a, on the one hand, I have my sort of semi-career as an academic, which I always kind of keep a little separate from my career as a when I say writer, I mean as a fiction writer. So as a fiction writer, I kind of do come to this, aesthetically, but I don't think that means that that then means that you cannot have an approach that is political and that is historical. And I can't help because just of who I am. I mean, I am interested in, I feel like everything is politics to me, or everything is political. So I'm not one of those people who will just say, oh, only aesthetics. I definitely believe in this aesthetic quality, and, I'm honored you would even sort of use the word poet or poetic, but I also feel as though to deny the political realities of what it's like to be a black person in America, a black person during this time, a woman during this time, is to then not actually give credence to the sounds and the emotions that actually form, the words that you hear, So I feel as though, I guess I talk about this sometimes with friends of mine like Tim Bajez, who recently won People's Prize for Olio, and Natasha Trethewey. Just I happen to see her partner's a historian, and we talk about this. She's the former poet laureate of the United States. All of it for us is just like a lot of it's sound, and who the line and the tension between the line and what you're doing with individual words, and then what you're doing with the sort of recaptured language. But I don't think that negates at all, anything that is sort of shedding light on what America is, what America was. And perhaps that's just because I've considered myself a sort of amateur historian. Like my background is literature, but my love is literature. But I can't help but not be interested in these aspects of the African American tradition and African American history. I don't know. I'm hoping that helps.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. It's so fascinating to me as a historian that you're. It's so fascinating to me as a historian that you're working through many of the same issues and questions that we are in history. And I just know in my field, which is colonial Latin America, there was recently a book that came out by historian David Wheat, where he argues that, in fact, the Americas, especially the Caribbean basin, were in fact settled by people of African descent, Africans and people of African descent. And they are really the first sort of settler population in the Americas. Yes. And I'm just curious, as a literary person, so this opens up a whole host of questions for historians, right? But as a literary person, how does this allow us to reimagine the frontier if we're looking at it, and the West, if we're looking at it through the eyes of black characters like Cathay or Lazarus? Is this a space not of rugged American individualism? Instead, it's a space of fugitivity or...
What was that word you used?
Fugitivity.
Fugitivity, thank you.
Or anonymity, or a sort of self-fashioning as a citizen. Yes. How does this allow us to change how we understand this space in this moment?
I'm so glad that you brought up. I mean, one of the things I ended up having to read, especially not just the Kane sections that I was doing, but were a lot of Caribbean, like what Kane was like in Haiti, and what was in the Dominican Republic, and all these different in Cuba, and the history of sugar and all that stuff. So that it's intricately linked, and a lot of what the Louisiana slaves brought to. Their cultivation and their knowledge was from the Caribbean. So there's that. In terms of history and literature combining, I feel as though one of the sort of superpowers that literature has is that you are able to sort of show, you know, these places where here are these African Americans, and I love that word you said, the fugitivity. Like here they are supposed to be, sort of these fugitives, and they're like, but actually they make it this other. They make it into this world which is theirs. Like they go to every town that they end up being, or they're on forts, and the forts are near towns, and they find these ways of, there is literally like this one character who goes through and he just rides through the saloon on a horse. I mean, although I've heard these in other narratives too, so I wonder, like, to what extent, like, people keep, how many people can go through a town saloon on a horse? But they'll like, there's one with the whites wanted to, this soldier was convicted of robbing or doing something, and they wanted to have this trial, but they wanted the soldier to marry his wife first as a kind of almost carnival kind of thing, and so or a sort of display, and the soldiers can refuse that from happening by gradually kind of like having the fight with all the sort of the white townspeople. So all these kinds of things where it seems kind of ridiculous or crazy or like impossible they would have been able to do some of this stuff. It sounds like they would have just instantly been hung or killed or whatever. But they ended up doing a lot of stuff that ends up making these places able to be settled by black people, and on the one hand, whites settled these places because they did, as Professor Gates said, they had to clear, like what the Army would call clear Native Americans off from these various places. But they were also called upon when the Army, the Army itself had to contend with what it meant for them to drive off Native Americans. So the Army, even while the echelons of the Army sometimes saw that, the whole system was corrupt, the agents were corrupt, they would steal the money, the rations from the Native Americans. The Native Americans, Apache in particular, which I deal with, would go off and raid. And so the Army itself was kind of put in this position of being the middle guy between the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the War Department, all this stuff, and then the Native Americans. So the black soldiers became part of, later on, this machinery that actually tried to help and protect the Native Americans from being encroached upon by white, settlers, the boomers in Oklahoma, the Sooners. So the blacks were part of this, and like this kind of way in which we don't hear the story of them settling, the West the way we hear the stories of whites settling the West, or Mexicans, Texas was Mexico. So when you have like the story of like the El Paso Salt War, which African Americans participated in helping some of the Paseños retain the salt that they were making a living from. These are just stories that are kind of lost to history. Or Victoria, who was a greater warrior than Geronimo, who actually at the time was considered like a sort of clown of, because he was not kind of the way that. Sorry, I'm going sort of a little far afield. I can answer those questions later. But in terms of them settling these spaces, I think literature provides a way of showing this, the way that history, you'd have to read 10 history books, 12 history books, or whatever to get this sort of cumulative sense of what happened. And some of the stuff that I'm trying to do is trying to condense a lot of that. Yes. Oh yeah, Leah. Oh, I don't know. Oh, Florence. Yes.
Consider the representation of African American men in literature. How or what will Lazarus add to that, expand, or what kind of dimensionality will your characterization bring to it?
Yeah, I kind of. So this is the amazing Florence Ladd. She was asking, what kind of representation will my character Lazarus bring to the portrayal of African American men in literature? And I would say that as a writer, I can only hope for what I think that what he'll add to it. I could never say he will do this and he will do that and he will do this and fill these categories. I had to first start as with him as this character who is this sort of combination and this sort of amalgamation of all of these different characteristics of someone who is this young man at this time who is newly freed, you know, and supposedly there's all these things that he's supposed to be able to do. And of course we know that, you know, during Reconstruction, that wasn't the case, you know, and things are more fraught and more full of more peril. But I ended up having to, in the end, just address him as, here is this person who could be broken, you know, by, you know, the deaths of his parents, you know, by his sister being deaf, by him trying to provide this way for her to live and exist and to take care of her in whatever way that he can. And for her to be, you know, sort of fighting against him and trying to claim her own sort of autonomy and all that kind of stuff. But I similar to Cathay, I kind of, and then I know this sounds like I'm being very inarticulate, and I guess I am being inarticulate, but I had to kind of enter this space in which I was just being him for a while. And this, I don't mean to make it sound like very new agey or channeling something, or maybe, but I don't know, that's the closest thing I can say to it. And there were times when I just would, you know, I would be thinking like him, or I'd be reading passages of what would happen with Kane, or what would happen during the 1866 riots, and I would have to know where he was at a particular time. And then I would just be I would be frozen sometimes, or have just tremors, or be crying, and it would take me a while to actually write, you know, what had happened to him. So I don't know how that can be, how you will feel when you get the actual finished manuscript in your hand, or the actual story in your hand. But for me, I can only sort of just go through the experience first, and then only hope for what, you know, he will do in literature later. Like, I can't impose that upon him yet.
Yes, Zizi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, the thousands.
Oh, so sweet. Thank you.
So as a musicologist, I always have a question for artists around process.
Yes.
But then this other thing just came up, and I think I better ask that first, and we have the year, thank God, to talk about these things. I'm curious where entertainment might show up in this work, and if it does at all, sort of in their day-to-day, and they're moving around. I'm thinking about, blackface is one of my main sort of, I'm thinking about Stephen Foster's Oh, Susanna, that became sort of a theme song of moving Western, and actually a lot of the main sort of blackface entertainment tunes that developed in the 40s, between the 1840s and 60s, were about this manifest movement and all these kinds of, and Gold Rush. So I'm curious how or where entertainment shows up and in what way, because there's so much going on here. Because I'm also thinking about an image that I can see but I can't place, but that I will try to search for, but that kind of represents the Buffalo Soldiers in the blackface context. And so I'm just curious about just how and where entertainment shows up in the space, and how that aesthetic sort of movement also moves the narrative that you're showing here in a way.
Yeah, I will say that I'm going to see if I can find this one little thing. I don't know if I can find it here, but in terms of entertainment, one of the things I ended up doing was I kept, this is very embarrassing. This is like a process thing, which if you talk about process, this will show you sort of like my little bit, my process if I could go through. So I don't want you to see all of this because it's kind of a weird thing. Like I sometimes will have little bits, oh no. So yeah, sometimes what I'll do is I'll have like, one of the things you can't read this, and I'm glad you can't, but but I'll go through, like sometimes I'll have like little bits that I'm looking things up, and whenever I find something, so this, as you see, is like, you know, the New Orleans musicians, the New Orleans, you know, musicians and what they would have, like, you know, so I would find things about like, okay, don't read my misspellings and all that stuff. What would happen, how they would play on the pianos, or, you know, study music or whatever. So all of this is kind of stuff that I just collect. I'll put a whole bunch of stuff in Keynote, and then when something when I feel as though something's happening, I'm not sort of thinking, oh, here's a section where they're going to be playing music or whatever. But then there'll be a section, and I'll know that this is eventually, when I feel it, I'll be like, okay, this is the section, and I know parts of it, and I'll wait to see if I can hear something. you know, I've like gone through, here's the slave songs, or here's this, but there's in particular with the New Orleans kind of tradition, you know, the stuff that eventually led to jazz, you know, all this stuff was the stuff that I kind of tried to immerse myself in. And then there are the songs that they would sort of sing as they would march, you know, and a lot of these were still a lot of, you know, hymns and spirituals, and they would kind of modify them sometimes to go to the beat of actually horses, you know, clomping along. So this is something I do think about because sometimes I'm just like, I'm so thinking sometimes of dialogue, and here's their narrative. And then it's just sort of like, you'll see these pictures of them playing, you know, the band, you know, and I was just sort of, you know, they had time to actually, you know, play and make music and do this on their own and sort of create a hybrid kind of music that wasn't just spirituals or whatever, but actually ended up being a little bit allied to the workman kind of like beats that they would have to go along with as you know, army soldiers, which you can think of, and I hate to make this comparison, but I think it just begs being made of like chain gangs because of like having to do a certain work to a certain beat, but because some of their time was, you know, fraught with complete peril where they just didn't know whether they were going to live or die. In other stretches, they're bored. They had like lots of different sort of types of music where they had like long stretches and they would talk or sing or whatever, or they'd have stretches where they were just singing along to a kind of march, but not a march. So one of the colonels would talk about how they're always singing. You know, he was just making this sort of, he was just sort of a wonderment that like everywhere, you know, because he had previously been with a white regiment. He was like, they're always singing. They're making things into songs or whatever. And this brings up something else, is that because I don't have their diaries, like a lot of times the only time that you actually will hear some of their voices, I think Professor Gates mentioned being court-martialed, or is like court-martial. So you're always trying to strip away the sort of context of infractions and negativity and sort of get like whatever sort of bits that come from the soldiers themselves. But yeah, they sang all the time. They're always making music, and that's something that I have to think about. But I'm going to be enlisting your help doing it.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have one. Thank you so much for this today. Could you talk a bit more about the title? The Thousands?
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to take this off. The title, yeah. So in this one excerpt of Cathay that I mentioned, the thousands comes up, but and I don't want to reveal too much because it sort of comes up in different ways, and what time it comes up, it has sort of different metaphorical implications. But for me, one of the seminal books that, you know, we have Many Thousands Gone. You know, Toni Morrison, when she begins Beloved, she says 6 million and more, you know, more, 60 million more. The loss of, you know, black life, of, you know, for various reasons. You know, you have thousands who live, but you have thousands who have gone for, you know, been killed and, you know, many different ways. And kind of the beginning of the novel, I really wanted to not have this one scene where this person is lynched, and that kind of starts off Lazarus sort of being somewhat more political and becoming more joining this kind of fight to kind of like for labor, you know, in the cane fields and such. But this idea of like, well, whose story, you know, gets lost when someone, you know, dies. So that's partly it. I don't want to say that's completely it, but the idea of these like many thousands gone has always been sort of haunting to me. And there are times when I'm writing and then somehow it'll like pop up in this other way that I hadn't quite intended or hadn't even foreseen. So I as I'm revising a lot of this stuff and putting different drafts together, like there was like almost 1,000 pages too, I just kind of, I'm trying to like think about it and not let it be something that's over-determined, but yeah, but the hauntiness of just loss Black life kind of permeates through the entire novel.
How long, just quickly, how long could a woman actually pass as a man among the buffaloes? So, I mean, I think about, I've written about her.
Yeah.
I think about, where'd she go to the bathroom? You know?
Yeah, I have. Trust
Stand
me,
there
I had
with
to
the
think about
guys
that.
having to take a leak, right?
Yeah.
Where's Cathay Williams?
Yeah, yeah.
So, what's your...
She passed until the end. Well, she got sick, as you probably know. She got so only when she was in infirmary, I think 3 different times. Only the last time, was the time in which they discovered that she was. But this was so I must admit, like I make her partly in my story, and I think there's room for her to be in the cavalry. But in terms of she was considered to be in the infantry, right? But there were only her cousin, I guess a distant cousin knew, and that was maybe it. But this was going on. This is going on. I think I don't know if it was quite 10 years or so. But she passed the other thing that's that we don't know, and this is on another whole other slide level, is that if you were a man or a woman during this era, black or white, like if you put on, like you're a woman and put on male clothes, there was just no people would not suspect, that you would be someone who was trying to pass. It was just sort of like a
No, it's when she took them off. That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. But here's what I think. The other thing that you have to know about this time period is that, they just didn't really bathe that often. Like this was not a kind of thing. And we always like to say, No. No. I mean, they would, if you were in a stream or whatever, and of course there are ways in which you could go out and you try to go to the cistern or whatever, all different places. But this was one of the things that, having to do a lot of this research, I mean, bathing was infrequent. I mean, to the extent that, you just start to itch sometimes after they do have extensive things about like the types of insect life that not only just around them, but on them, And
on this happy note, we're going to have lunch.
Thank you so much.
Let's give it up for ZZ Packer. That was fabulous.
Thank you so much.
My fellow Yaler.
Oh, I know.
What college were you in?
I was in Trumbull.
I was in Calhoun.
Calhoun, yeah, renamed now.
Still Calhoun.
Is it still? I thought it was.